Hello, NFL football fans and fantasy football owners. It's NFL fantasy football expert analyst Lance Goodman checking in. We're heading into week 3 of the 2017 NFL preseason, and I'm here to give fantasy football owners some great tips as they head into their live drafts. Tip number 1, make sure that you get to your draft early. In most drafts, there may be some Adobe or Flash settings that your computer may need to download in order for you to enter your league draft. The last thing that you want to do is try to get to your draft, within 2 to 5 minutes and just try to log on and get right into it. A lot of times you're not able to do so, and it costs you some valuable draft picks early on. So make sure that you get to your draft about 20 minutes early just to make sure that everything is working fine with your computer. You're not having any type of internet problems. You can get into your draft smoothly and be ready to go. Tip number 2, make sure that you have the volume turned all the way up on your computer, your laptop, your phone, or whatever mobile device you're using to draft. Having the volume up allows for you to hear when the draft starts. There's usually some type of sound, usually a horn or something like that, to let you know that the draft has begun. And then there's a sound that goes off when it is your turn to draft. That's very important. I've gotten to drafts years ago. I'm pretty sure we've all done it before. And you have the volume down. You're busy at that time, kind of multitasking and doing some different things. The draft starts and you miss out, especially if you have one of the first couple draft picks. And then again, a lot of times we're multitasking while the draft is going on. If you don't have the volume up, your turn could sneak up without you knowing, and you end up missing your draft pick. On that note, if you do end up going on auto draft, what you want to do is make sure that you take yourself off auto draft as soon as possible. What is auto draft? When you are making the selections or drafting players yourself, for whatever reason, if you run out of time on the clock and you don't make a selection, the computer is going to automatically make a selection for you. We call it auto draft. What happens a lot of times, whatever the rankings are on a respective site, whether it's ESPN, Yahoo, the rankings that they have the players, the computer will pick the highest ranked player, and a lot of times it's a player that you don't want on your team. But if it does happen, make sure you immediately check the box or find the box that says auto draft and take yourself off auto draft so you can start controlling your draft picks again, because if you don't, the computer will continue to make draft picks for you. Number 4, make sure that you know your league format, meaning, is it a 3 wide receiver league? Is it a league that has a flex play? Is it a league that selects defensive players? Is it a league that has 2 quarterbacks? Make sure that you definitely check the league format so you can draft properly. The last thing that you want to do is be in a league that maybe has 3 wide receivers and you stack up on running backs early and you don't end up with those high-powered wide receivers. Tip number 5, make sure that you've got your draft board in order. How important is that? Number 1, make sure that you have a list of players that you really want, a list of players that you're targeting and that you want to covet, players that you really want on your team. Make sure that you have a list of those players so as you're moving through your draft, you can make sure to land those guys. A lot of times when you're watching a board, you may have to draft that player a little bit earlier than you want to, but if you really want that player on your team, that's what you'll need to do. What you'll also want to do on your draft board is make a list of the top 10 players at each respective position, meaning quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end, and even kicker in defense special teams, and then in leagues where it's IDP, where you have individual defensive players. But make a list of the top 10 players at each respective position so you can make sure that you're landing the best players on your team. To help you out with that, make sure to visit NFLExporter.com. That's spelled www.NFLExporter.com. There you'll find the most up-to-date and accurate rankings anywhere in the world to help you out with your fantasy football draft and ranking your players. The next thing that you want to do is, when you're building your fantasy football team in the first couple rounds, you definitely want to make it a point to draft the best or I should say the stud players. These are going to be the players who are going to be the heart and soul of your team, the players you're going to be dependent on weekly to pump in double digits for you and have those huge games throughout the course of the season. But as you start to move through your draft, you definitely want to make sure to do a couple things. Number one, you want to have a roster that has as much quality depth and as much value and a team that is well-rounded as possible. So as you're moving along, you definitely want to make sure that you're picking players with value and picking players who are heavily involved on their respective teams, so that if one of your star players gets injured, one of your star players has a bye week or a tough matchup, you should be able to go to your bench with confidence and plug in a guy. If it's a running back, you want a running back who gets a lot of touches, preferably a starter on that team. If it's a wide receiver, you want to get a guy who gets a lot of targets. So again, if one of your players gets injured, if it's a bye week or a very tough matchup, you want to go to your bench with confidence and plug in a player who's heavily involved and can pay dividends for your team that week. Also, drafting a team with quality depth and players who have value allows for you to get a great supporting cast. You want to surround those stars with as many quality players as possible so you can pump out the most points on a weekly basis. And speaking of value, and speaking of having a balance and a lineup that has quality depth and value, how about making sure that you draft the best handcuffs? That's right. If it's a running back, maybe we're talking about Devonta Freeman in Atlanta, DeMarco Murray in Tennessee, the backup running backs there, Tevin Coleman in Atlanta, Derrick Henry for Tennessee. Those guys are involved anyway, but if an injury occurred to Freeman, if an injury occurred to DeMarco Murray, those backup running backs at that point become starters, and those guys are just as legitimate or quality a start as Devonta Freeman or DeMarco Murray will be for that respective week. If it's a wide receiver, you want to draft a wide receiver number 2 who gets a lot of targets and involved. An example that comes to mind would be Jordy Nelson out for the Green Bay Packers. He's the number 1 receiver there. If he were to have an injury, the number 2 receiver there is Devonta Adams. He at that point will move over to the number 1 wide receiver and be the top target for that team that week. You also, as you're moving along your draft, this is a basic fundamental and principle used in the NFL. Always draft the best player available. In the event that you're not able to draft the player that you want, and it's happened to us all before, I'm pretty sure it happened to you this year, you want to draft a player and someone else drafts him a couple picks ahead of you. At that point, draft the best player available. That player has value on your team, but most importantly, they have value to make a trade with. When the draft is over, a lot of times owners are in a similar predicament as you, where they missed out on a player that they want, or they want to strengthen a particular position. And if you have a roster that is filled with guys who have value, then you're able to package up some players and make a trade and be able to bring in some players on your team that you really want. For other great tips and all your fantasy football coverage heading into the 2017 NFL season, make sure to visit www.NFLExporter.com. That's NFLExporter.com, a leading source for NFL football and fantasy football advice.